They dragged him out of his car and threw false charges at him until he had no choice but to reveal who he truly was. It was late at night in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and the streets were mostly quiet, with only the occasional flicker of traffic lights switching from red to green. James Wilder, an experienced assistant U.S. attorney, had just finished a dinner with his colleagues. He wasn't thinking about work, justice, or the courtroom, only about getting home. That all changed the moment he saw the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. With a sigh, he signaled, pulled over, and reached for his wallet. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a red light, and there was no reason for the stop. But he knew better than to expect reason to play a part in this. Two officers walked up to his window. Officer Mark Harris, tall with a military haircut, stood on the driver's side, while Officer Sean Reed, leaner but still imposing, stayed near the passenger door. "License and registration," Harris said, his tone sharp. James handed over his documents. "Can I ask why I was stopped?" Harris exchanged a quick look with Reed before responding. "Your taillight's out." James frowned. This wasn't true. His car had just passed inspection, and the rearview mirror clearly showed his brake lights were working. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Harris's face shifted just a little as he leaned in. "Sir, step out of the vehicle." A tense feeling crept through James's body. He'd dealt with cases like this before, where a simple stop escalated into something far worse. His instinct told him to comply, but his experience told him these officers were already making things worse. "I'm not getting out until you tell me why," Reed smirked, resting his hand on his belt. "Because we said so." James took a breath. He knew the law inside and out. He had spent years learning it, defending it, and enforcing it. He knew he didn't have to step out unless they had a good reason. "I have the right to ask why I'm being ordered out of my car." Harris's patience snapped. He ripped the door open. "Step out now." Before James could react, Harris grabbed his wrist and yanked him forward. The seatbelt dug into his shoulder painfully. "What the hell are you doing?" James yelled, instinctively trying to pull back. Harris didn't answer. He just pulled harder. Seconds later, Reed was on the other side, yanking James's arm behind his back. The cold metal cuffs bit into his skin. "You're resisting," Harris said, his voice cold. James stared in disbelief as Reed slammed him against the hood of his own car. His heart raced, not from fear, but from anger. This wasn't just a stop, it was a game, a trap, and they thought they had already won. But they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The courtroom in the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse was crowded. The air was thick with the usual sounds of clerks shuffling papers, the occasional cough, and the quiet buzz of whispered conversations. But beneath it all, there was something else simmering. James sat at the defense table, his posture tense but controlled. He wasn't here as a lawyer today. He was the one facing charges of resisting arrest, obstruction, and disorderly conduct, all made up. But James already knew the truth didn't matter. What mattered was what could be proven. At the front of the room, Judge Emma Turner sat high on the bench, her sharp gaze sweeping the room. In her early 60s, she had the kind of presence that demanded respect, whether it was deserved or not. Her reputation was strong, no nonsense, and quick to dismiss anything that seemed out of place. And from the way she barely glanced at him, James knew exactly how this would play out. The prosecutor, Daniel Hayes, walked confidently, like someone who knew the odds were on his side. He adjusted his tie and gave a nod to the officers sitting proudly at the witness stand. James watched as Harris and Reed sat there smug, knowing they had the full power of the system on their side. "Your Honor," Hayes began, "this is a straightforward case where an individual turned a simple traffic stop into a violent confrontation with law enforcement." James exhaled slowly. The arrogance, The sheer nerve. Hayes continued, flipping through his notes. The defendant refused to obey the officer's lawful orders, became aggressive, and had to be restrained for everyone's safety. James's lawyer, Adam Green, an overworked and underpaid public defender, jumped to his feet. Objection. There's no evidence my client was aggressive. Judge Turner waved her hand dismissively. Overruled. James clenched his jaw, fast. Green sighed, but didn't give up. Your Honor, the officers made things worse without any reason. There's no body cam footage showing my client being aggressive because it doesn't exist. Hayes smirked. The body cams were not functioning at the time of the arrest, but the officers' statements are more than enough to prove it. James almost laughed at how absurd it all was. The officers' words were all they needed. Convenient, wasn't it? Harris was the first to take the stand, reciting his rehearsed lines. The defendant was aggressive from the start, he said smoothly. He refused to get out of the car, raised his voice, and created a hostile situation. Every word was a lie. Reed followed, nodding as he added, he tensed up. We were afraid for our safety. We had no choice but to restrain him. More lies. James's hands tightened into fists under the table. He had spent his whole career fighting against this kind of open corruption, and now he was living it. Judge Turner barely hid her impatience as she glanced at James's lawyer. Anything else, Mr. Green? Green hesitated. He knew this judge well, knew her reputation. She wasn't interested in justice. Still, he swallowed hard and pressed on. Yes, Your Honor, the defense calls James Wilder to the stand. This was it. As James stood up and walked toward the witness stand, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, watching, judging, waiting for him to crack. But he wouldn't. What was about to happen would change everything. James sat down in the witness chair, exhaling slowly as the court clerk swore him in. His hands rested lightly on his lap, but inside he was boiling. He wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to expose the truth. Prosecutor Hayes stepped forward, pacing slightly, a show of unnecessary confidence. Mr. Wilder, would you say you complied with the officer's orders during your traffic stop? James met his gaze, calm and controlled. I asked why I was being ordered out of my car. That's not illegal. Hayes pretended to sigh. You refused to exit, correct? I asked why I was being asked to step out, James repeated, which legally I have the right to do. Hayes smirked, glancing at the jury as though James's logic was a nuisance. And after multiple orders, you still didn't comply? James held his stare. Because there was no lawful reason to. Hayes turned to the judge, shaking his head as if he had expected nothing less. Your Honor, it's clear the defendant. James leaned forward, his voice even. Before we go any further, I should probably disclose something. The room went silent. Hayes hesitated. Even Judge Turner looked up, really noticing him for the first time. James reached into his briefcase, and his lawyer Green tensed, unsure of what was happening. Slowly, James pulled out his badge, just a simple small rectangle. That small piece of paper had suddenly become the most dangerous thing in the room. I'm James Wilder, he said, his voice slicing through the tension like a knife. Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District. The room went silent. Judge Turner's lips parted slightly, her gavel hovering over her desk, but unmoving. The officer stiffened, and Reed's knee bounced under the table. Harris's jaw clenched, and Hayes's face went pale. Excuse me? Hayes stammered. James tilted his head. Did I stutter? The air shifted. The jury leaned in. The stenographer stopped typing. Even Green, his own lawyer, looked like he had just been struck by a freight train. You're a federal prosecutor? Hayes's voice wavered just a bit. James lifted his ID, showing it clearly. That's what this says, doesn't it? And just like that, the entire case fell apart. Judge Turner leaned back in her chair, her mouth pressing into a thin line. She knew that if she ruled against James now, if she dismissed his testimony and sided with the officers, this wouldn't be just another forgotten case. It would be a scandal. The courtroom wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a ticking time bomb, and James had just lit the fuse. The room held its breath. Judge Turner's grip on her gavel tightened, but she didn't strike it down. Not yet. She was thinking, calculating. This wasn't just a simple case anymore. This was a career-ending disaster waiting to unfold. Hayes swallowed hard. His smooth arrogance, the confidence he had worn so easily, was gone. He turned to the officers, and for the first time, Reed and Harris looked nervous. James sat there watching them scramble for control. He had seen this before. In boardrooms, back office meetings, hushed conversations between prosecutors when the wrong case landed on their desk. But this time, he was the one forcing their hand. "I wasn't aware of this information," Hayes stammered, flipping through his files, like a man looking for a way out. "Your Honor, Judge Turner raised a hand, silencing him for the first time. Her eyes locked onto James's. His presence alone was now a threat. A government prosecutor wrongfully arrested, assaulted, and lied about. Had this gone unnoticed, he could have easily become just another forgotten statistic, and she knew it. She turned to the officers. "Reed? Harris?" she said, her tone sharp. Both men sat up straighter, like children about to be scolded. "Would you like to amend your statements?" Silence. A crack appeared in their composure. James could see it happening. Harris's fingers tightened around his knee, and Reed looked at Hayes as if hoping for some kind of help. James spoke first, cutting through the tension. "Before they answer that, Your Honor, I'd like to request that the court pull the dispatch call logs from the night of my arrest." Hayes flinched. James wasn't guessing. He knew exactly how these things worked. If the officers had radioed in before the stop, their lie about the taillight wouldn't hold up. But if they hadn't, then they had broken protocol from the start. Judge Turner studied him for a long moment. She was trapped. If she denied his request, she would be covering up evidence. But if she approved it, she would be giving James the final piece of the puzzle. She cleared her throat. "Request granted." Harris exhaled sharply, his composure finally cracking. Reed shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenching. They both knew what was coming next. James leaned back in his seat. He wasn't done yet. This case wasn't going to stay in this courtroom. It started with a single reporter sitting in the back of the room, a young journalist from the Baton Rouge Advocate, furiously typing on her laptop. Within hours, the story spread. By the next morning, James's name was everywhere. Assistant U.S. Attorney wrongfully arrested by Baton Rouge cops. Federal prosecutor exposes corrupt officers in open court. Judge under fire for bias against black defendant who was a government lawyer. The internet exploded. Social media flooded with clips from inside the courtroom, taken by people who had attended the trial. The moment James revealed his badge became a viral video, spreading across platforms like wildfire. Cable news stations ran segments on the case's far-reaching impact, how many others had been mistreated like James but lacked the power or position to fight back. But the real change began in Baton Rouge itself. Community activists organized rallies, and protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding accountability. Civil rights attorneys began reviewing old cases handled by Judge Turner, looking for patterns of bias. Then the biggest bombshell hit, an anonymous leak. Internal police records, emails between officers discussing how to justify questionable stops, statements from other black drivers who had been pulled over, falsely cited for violations, then threatened with arrest if they argued back. The case wasn't just about James Wilder anymore. It was about a system that had been operating in the shadows for years. And now the floodlights were on. But the people in power were already scrambling. They weren't going down without a fight. The backlash was swift. City officials scrambled, the police department released a carefully worded statement, and Judge Turner's office suddenly stopped answering calls. By the end of the week, the Baton Rouge Police Department announced an internal investigation. It was a weak, performative gesture. James had seen it all before. A distraction, a way to calm the public without actually making any real changes. But this time, it wasn't enough. The pressure kept growing. A civil rights attorney filed a federal lawsuit against the department on behalf of past victims. Community leaders demanded that Judge Turner be removed from the bench. Protesters refused to back down. Then came the real moment of reckoning. The case was handed over to Louisiana's Attorney General for review. James sat in his apartment watching the press conference. His phone buzzed constantly, calls from journalists, lawyers, and people who had gone through exactly what he had but didn't have the badge to fight back. This wasn't just about damage control anymore. They were running out of ways to hide. And Judge Turner knew it. By the time James returned to court for the verdict, her expression had changed. No more casual disinterest. No more overconfidence. She was now facing a case too big to ignore. She had to decide which side of history she wanted to be on. But the question remained, would it be real justice or just another calculated move to protect the system? The courtroom was silent. Judge Turner cleared her throat. The weight of the past few weeks hung heavily on her shoulders. The protests, the media attention, the leaked files. She had no good options left. She looked down at her notes, but everyone knew this decision wasn't just hers anymore. It was the public's. She exhaled and set her gavel down softly. After reviewing the evidence, the court finds the defendant. She hesitated for just a moment, then finally, not guilty. A wave of relief washed over James, but he didn't move. He didn't react, not yet, because the case wasn't just about him. The officers sat there stiffly, their faces pale. Reed's hands were clenched, his career flashing before his eyes. Harris, always the more arrogant of the two, leaned forward. "Your Honor, She raised a hand to silence him. "The court will also be forwarding all relevant materials to the state attorney's office for further review." That was it. The officers weren't getting away from this. The courtroom erupted. Murmurs, gasps, the rapid clicking of reporters' keyboards. For the first time, the system had turned its gaze back on itself. James stood slowly. His lawyer patted his back, but his eyes were locked on the officers, on the prosecutor, Hayes, who looked like he'd just lost everything, and on the judge, who had spent years dismissing cases like his, until she had no choice but to do otherwise. But most of all, he thought about the people who weren't in this room, the ones who had sat where he was now, the ones who never got to walk free. As he stepped out of the courtroom, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. People cheered, but James wasn't celebrating. This wasn't a victory. It was proof. Proof of everything that had always been happening, but only now, with the world watching, had the system been forced to react. And James knew the fight wasn't over, not for him, and not for the people still trapped in it. He walked past the flashing lights and into the crowd, where voices called for real change, because one case wasn't enough. And now, no one was looking away. If this story made you think, even for a second, then it's time to ask yourself, how many more stories like this are out there? How many people never get their moment in court? How many names never make the news? How many truths go unheard? It's not enough to just see injustice. We have to challenge it. So if you believe that real justice means holding power accountable, then share this story. Talk about it. Pay attention. Because the more people who refuse to look away, the harder it becomes for these cases to be swept under the rug. And that's how change begins.